Hey guys, Brian here from Better Chess Training, and in today's video, we're going to be talking about our chess thought process. So this is the process we use to come up with a move. So check out this video, and I hope you enjoy it. Okay, when we are talking about the chess thought process, what we're really talking about here is how do we select a chess move? And although our thinking may slightly vary depending on if it's a very tactical situation or if we're winning by a lot or we're in a theoretical end game, in general, the your thought process for any chess move, and again, this is mainly focused on longer chess games or correspondence, not on blitz. Uh, there's going to be four steps that we are going to have to examine. Okay. Before I get onto those steps, some general thoughts when it comes to improving our thought process is that the first step is to be aware of what we think during the game. So, this is why I encourage you, and I've talked about this before, to analyze your games after the fact, including putting down what you thought about. Because it's not just about whether you made a right move or a wrong move, but how did you come to the move that you came to? Because that will help determine whether or where you need to improve your knowledge or your skills in order to make a better choice the next time. Okay, so the first step in that, of course, is the self awareness. And the way to do this is to capture your thoughts. Again, right after the game or soon after is probably best. And a way to shortcut this sometimes is not just your games, but even your tactical problems or whenever you're solving any type of chess problem, to write down what you think. Again, this takes some time, but it can be worth it. Okay. Uh, the next part here is objectivity. And this is the difficult part of trying to improve your thought process is that sometimes it's painful to see what we didn't see during the games. And also to be aware of where we can improve and what we're actually thinking. This is where chess coaches, especially very experienced chess coaches who focus on your thought process, can be very helpful. However, in this video, we're going to be talking about steps where you can improve on your own. And then finally, before we move on, is what you're really trying to do in these improvement tips that I'm going to be sharing is developing good habits and reducing bad habits when it comes to your thought process. Okay, well, let's move on and talk about the four C's. Okay, I've talked about four steps to the thought process and before, that were proposed by other people, but I've kind of to make it easier to remember, I've developed the four C's, and they kind of build upon each other. And first one is to consider. That's to consider the factors that are involved in the position, including positional factors and tactical factors. Candidates. So this is producing the actual moves that you're going to look at to decide, that you're actually going to consider for the move you're going to make. Calculate. This is where you look at each move and you look at the possible responses by your opponent and then your follow-ups. And then finally choose. This is where you evaluate what you saw during the previous phases and make a choice. So we're going to talk about each of these in a little more detail. Okay, the first step is consider. And here is where you look at threats. For example, if your opponent's threatening to take a piece or threatening to checkmate you, you need to have that in your consideration. Okay. The second one are positional factors. What are the open files? The key diagonals, key squares you need to be looking at. What are the good minor pieces you have? Pawn structure, king safety. So those are parts of it. This phase also includes planning. So, for example, if you want to improve one of your pieces, what is the plan that you're going to try to undertake, or maybe mini plans. Again, these plans don't have to be these 10 move uh, dissertations. They could just be, I want to improve my rook, so I'm going to put it on an open file. Then you need to calculate whether your opponent can will allow you to do that and such. Okay, and so a key question you want to ask yourself throughout this is what other factors should I consider to make sure that you have everything that you need. Now, when we look at some common mistakes at this phase, the main one, especially for beginning player, is missing threats. Leaving a piece hanging, leaving yourself open to like a fork or a pin. So these are that's a common mistake. Incomplete understanding of positional factors, and this is where you did not see something that's not necessarily a concrete threat. But for example, you didn't notice that your opponent can dominate a specific file, so you didn't do anything to stop it, or that your opponent could weaken your pawn structure with an exchange. So that would be incomplete understanding of positional factors. And finally, having no plan. Again, the plan doesn't have to be a long one. I know if you've studied some of the positional books like Jeremy Silman, or read some annotated games by like Botvinnik, they come up with these plans that are 5, 6, 10 moves long, and sometimes you may need to plan that far ahead depending on the situation. But sometimes a plan, especially like in the opening, could be something to the effect of, I want to control d5. So here are the 2 or 3 moves I need to do, and I have to consider my opponent's possibilities as well. So, but one of the common mistakes is not having a plan, kind of just reacting or making one move threats. Finally, for this phase, here's some improvement tips. So these are ways you can actually improve this part of the thought process. The main one is to analyze your games. What are you seeing? What are you missing? Okay. And the second one is to study master games. And the most helpful for this is the ones that are annotated by the players themselves. Very good book I'm reading. A little more for intermediate and advanced players is a book by Gelfand on positional decision making, because he actually talks, he'll look at a position and he'll actually talk about what he thought about during the game, and then kind of the pros and cons of that. So, very good book. I'll put that link in the description. But there's a lot of good books by the players themselves where they talk about what they thought about during the game. So, those are good to study. And finally, having a good grasp of strategic and positional play in general, understanding what good pawn structures look like, understanding when bishops are better than knights and when knights are better than bishops. Having this knowledge will help to inform what you need to consider during the games. And of course, this is something that you develop over time. So don't feel that you have to master it all at once, okay? Okay, the next phase in the thought process, and I guess I should mention this, and I think I'll probably mention it a couple times, is that when the thought process, although the way I've listed it is sort of a linear way of doing it, sometimes when you're in one phase, for example, you're picking candidates, it might remind you, you might notice something else that you need to consider. Or when you're calculating something, you might notice from the calculations you make that you need to consider other uh, candidates. So even though you start typically with the consider phase, you can jump back and forth, and you're going to have to jump back and forth depending on what you find out during each step of the process. However, each step of the process does need to be completed in order to ensure that you're making the best move possible. Okay, let's continue here. So the candidate phase, this is where you start to pick the potential moves that you're going to make. Okay, and they should align with the factors from your consideration step. For example, if your opponent is threatening to checkmate you on the next move, then every candidate move should be able to deal with that. I mean, that's an extreme example. Or, for example, if a piece like your queen is being threatened, every candidate move should either protect that piece, trade that piece, or come up with a bigger threat. So every candidate needs to be in alignment with the factors involved with the position. And so the key question here is, what other moves accomplish my plans and goals? So sometimes you may decide that you need to protect your king, as I said, if your opponent is threatening checkmate, but don't just look for 1 or 2 moves. Look for all the moves possible that accomplish that. And then your job in the next step the calculation and the choose steps is to find out which of those moves is the best. So really in the candidate phase, we're really brainstorming for ideas that will help you accomplish your goals. Okay, let's look at some common mistakes here. So not looking for alternatives that accomplish the same goal. So that's kind of what I just mentioned, where you have a goal in mind and you don't produce enough candidates or enough alternatives to choose from. Overemphasizing forcing moves. A lot of times I will see this, and I've done this as well, where you will see a tactical line and then you end up going down it because it's very forcing and very easy to consider, where sometimes a quiet move may have been the best move in the position, or a more positional move that doesn't force your opponent's responses. Another mistake is not having enough candidate moves. And this is basically where your focus is too narrow. And the right move, for example, if you only consider one or two moves, well, maybe that third or fourth or fifth move may be the best move in the position. But if you don't even consider it, then you won't be able to pick it. Okay, and then finally, jumping to calculation too soon. So this is where you see a candidate move and then you spend a lot of time calculating it before you put out all your alternatives. Sometimes, especially if it's a forcing move, you might want to look real quick, maybe a couple moves down in a variation, just to see if you should even consider continuing to put it in your list of candidates. So for an example of this would be like something like a queen sacrifice or some type of sacrifice. You want to just maybe spend a few seconds just making sure that it doesn't lose before you keep it in your list of candidates. Okay, so those would be some common mistakes. Now let's think about how we can improve this phase of the process. So first thing is that look at some of your recent mistakes you've made in your games and see if you're producing enough candidate moves. So ask yourself, which moves did I consider during the game? And sometimes you might find out that you didn't even look at the winning move or the best move. Okay, so again, this is a self-awareness, and this is really the most important thing here when you're thinking about improving your thought process. The next one is solitary chess, which is basically guessing the move, maybe a master game. Solitary chess, this would include things like solving puzzles as well. But solitary chess, not just tactical positions, but even positional moves or moves where there's not anything obvious that you need to be doing. You want to practice creating multiple candidates, okay? And then finally, what you want to do is um, whether you're doing this in training or looking at one of your games that you just played, compare the candidates that you considered to what you thought of the position. And again, I use the tactical examples of threats, but even looking at like pawn structure. Are you producing candidates that try to take advantage of pawn structure, moves that attack weak pawns, or moves that help to protect your weaknesses? So you want to compare your candidates to those factors that you found in the previous step. Okay, let's move on to the next step. Okay, so the next phase is the calculation phase. This is where you calculate the possibilities. This is where you look ahead. So if you decide on a couple moves, this is where you start to see, well, what can my opponent do? And then, well, how am I going to respond to that? And so with that, what you're trying to develop is a principal variation. So this is what you think is your best move or one of your best moves. And then what's your opponent's best reply? What can he do to stop you or to try to further his plans, his or her plans, and then your response to that. And the principal variation could just be a few ply or a few moves ahead, or it might be very lengthy if it's a very concrete tactical position. So that's something that comes with experience on how long you should make the principal variation, and maybe worth a future video in and of itself. When you calculate, typically you're going to start with your forcing moves because those are going to be the most critical ones to evaluate and make sure that that doesn't cause a situation that you're going to need to deal with later down the line. So this is forcing moves on your end as well as forcing moves for your opponent. So forcing moves would be any checks, any captures, and any threats maybe to one of your pieces. So consider those first when you're doing the calculation phase. And the key question you want to ask yourself is, what is my opponent's best response? Okay, let's look at some of the common mistakes here. First off is fuzzy calculation. Sometimes, especially in very messy, complicated situations, we are very superficial and maybe you can call this laziness, and it's basically not forcing ourselves to look further down the line. And so that's a big mistake. I make it often myself, and sometimes that happens if we end up playing too much blitz as well. Although blitz can be helpful for other things, sometimes it can foster the habit of fuzzy calculation. The other one is more of I guess this is more of a skill, an unclear picture. So it's seeing the wrong things in the positions down the line. So for example, if you're looking, say, 4 or 5 moves ahead, being able to accurately see what is actually happening is important. And sometimes we have an unclear picture. We forget about a piece that's threatening something. And so that's often a mistake as well. And then finally, not looking for your opponent's best replies. And this happens a lot when you think you have a really good move. You think, okay, this is a really good move. It looks really good. It's aggressive. And what we have to make sure is that our opponent can't refute it. So you really want to look not just for the moves that lose. For example, if my opponent takes this, then I get to checkmate him in 3 moves. You want to look for, well, let's assume my opponent's not going to do that. Okay, what is the best move that he can make? You always want to be asking yourself that. And finally, how can we improve this phase? Well, I want you to look at the thoughts from your recent games. What did you miss when it comes to calculation? Again, self-awareness, that's our first step in improvement. Tactics problems will always be helpful because it forces you to look ahead and calculate, for the most part, if they're not one movers. And finally, a very special tip here that I've used myself very early in my chess playing days is checkmate problems, especially moves 2 movers, 3 movers I like a lot because it really is forcing you to look ahead. And the reason why I like checkmate problems is because it's really isolating the calculation phase, because you don't need to worry about evaluating the positions. Basically, is it checkmate or is it not checkmate? And therefore, you can actually focus on really just looking ahead and making sure your picture is accurate in your calculations. And the final tip is really analyze more on your own. Whether you're analyzing a master game that you're studying, analyzing a puzzle, or analyzing your own games after the fact, really analyze more on your own without using the chess engine. The chess engine will be important to check your conclusions, but you want to just have that practice of looking ahead. So even if you're analyzing with the board and moving the pieces or without, just make sure you're practicing more on your own, using your own thoughts and your own effort. Okay, let's move on to the final phase of the thought process, which is the choose phase. Okay, this final phase I call the choose phase. This is where you are going to pick the move you're going to play. You're going to evaluate the positions that you have, the end positions of your variations in the calculation step. And the key question you're going to ask yourself here is there anything better? And once you can finally answer, nope, there's nothing better, then you've got the move you're going to play. Let's look at some common mistakes. First off is the premature choice. And this often happens, especially in positions where there's a lot of tactics. You look at the first move that looks good or that doesn't lose, and then you just play it. And that happens a lot, especially if we don't feel we have enough time. So that's where experience comes in, especially with time controls. But in games like correspondence games or long tournament games, it shouldn't be this. You shouldn't really be making this mistake too often. Okay, the next one I call the rebound choice, and this is one that I do a lot. And this is where you spend a little bit of time calculating a promising line, and then you find out it just doesn't work. Your opponent has a refutation in one of the variations, and then you look at the second move and see that your opponent doesn't refute it, and then you quickly pick it without having properly evaluated it or looking at other choices. And so that's kind of a patience factor, as well as, again, experience and practice. And then finally, over optimism or over pessimism. This is where you think your position is better than it really is, and so you make a choice based on that, or you think your position is worse than it actually is. So for example, you kind of give up, and instead of looking for the best resistance, just kind of make a move because you think that you're losing. And so making these type of mistakes obviously are going to affect your ability to choose the best move. So let's look at some ways we can improve this part of our thought process. First one, again, involves looking at your own games. And what I want you to do here is look at evaluations you made during your games. Like, look at a position and say, here I thought I was winning, or here I thought I was even. And then see where you were wrong. And think about why. That's the key question. Is it because you didn't understand a specific position? For example, I played a master for one of my recent tournaments, and he mentioned that in this particular position with this particular pawn structure, that I didn't want to trade off my minor pieces. And so that was a piece of knowledge that I was missing, so it caused me to make the wrong decisions. Okay? I want you to also study the evaluations in annotated master games. So when you read one of the masters and he says, well, here white is better, or here black is better, right? And especially if it's a well annotated game like Yasser Seirawan, very good at annotation. He'll write why certain positions are better for which side. He'll say, oh, the pawn structure is better here, or one side has more threats and more options, or one side has a better minor piece, and really start to pick up what the masters are seeing in their games and what's good and what's bad in certain positions. And then one other exercise that I could suggest to you is that when you're studying, again, either your game or a master game, and you look at a position, right before you put the engine on, think to yourself, okay, if you had to give it a number, +1 or +0.5, or even if you used a more qualitative evaluation like white is winning or white has a slight edge, you want to compare that to the chess engine valuations. Now, sometimes the chess engine can be wrong, but for the most part, if you think white is winning and then the chess engine says no, black is winning, then you have to see why and see what did you miss. And that type of self-evaluative process will help you to improve your evaluations so that you can choose the best move out of all the options you made. Just a few final things here to help you with your thought process. It is a process of constant improvement. Don't feel that it's going to be like, well, let me spend a couple hours on my thought process and then I don't have to think about it again. It's going to be an evolutionary process, not what I call a revolutionary process. So make small improvements here and there. Even just learning to ask yourself the question, do I have a better move here? Can really have great results in your games. So think about, what can I improve each time? And think about that with every game that you play. Self-awareness is the first step, but it's not the only step. So for example, if you notice that you're making a specific error in your thought process, being aware of it is important, and in and of itself will help you. But doing some of those improvement tips that I mentioned earlier for that specific thought process is important to help make sure that you are constantly improving. And there's going to be two activities. There's a few exercises you can do, which I've mentioned. The two key activities that you're going to want to be doing more often than not is continue to analyze your games, and then also solve, and I don't mean hard tactics problems, but tactics problems that are difficult for you. Because this will, and so for beginners, that may just be mate and two problems, okay? And maybe for experienced players are going to be chess problems from, for example, Grandmaster Jakob Aagaard's Grandmaster Preparation. Those problems are hard for masters. So or somewhere in between. The idea here is that you want to stretch your ability both with your calculation. A lot of the tactics problems are going to be mainly improving your calculation skills, but it's also going to be improving other aspects of the thought process. So you want to make sure that you're solving those. Now that you've covered the 4 steps in the thought process, I want you to check out this video over here where I take those 4 steps and use a chess example and show you how I use the process to solve the problem.